What if the quaint village you trusted your entire life was secretly built on centuries of blood rituals, hidden chambers, and a network of murders no one dared to speak of? In the autumn of 1965, the Higgins family of 4 vanished without a trace from their peaceful cottage in Ashworth, Yorkshire. A case that might have remained just another unsolved mystery buried in the dusty files of local authorities, if it weren't for what investigators discovered 3 months later beneath St. Mary's Church. A hidden chamber littered with the family's personal belongings and chilling journals describing forbidden rituals banned by the Church of England for centuries. Even more shocking, the final journal entry was dated 2 weeks after the family's reported disappearance, suggesting they may have lived on in darkness, unseen. For nearly 60 years, the church has refused to comment, and the Higgins cottage stands abandoned to this day, its walls echoing with secrets no one dares investigate. But what makes this story a dark history nightmare is that when sealed church records were finally opened in 1985, authorities discovered the Higgins family was not the first to vanish under such sinister circumstances. Tonight, I'll reveal the truth behind one of England's most disturbing true crime cult mysteries, based on documents never made public until now, and the testimony of the only surviving witness willing to break 40 years of silence. If you crave the kind of forbidden secrets and chilling discoveries that few dare to uncover, subscribe now and let me know in the comments what country you're watching from. Because some mysteries don't stay buried forever. Imagine discovering that the place you called home, a charming English village wrapped in rolling hills and ancient stone walls, was hiding a doorway to a secret so dark it could tear apart everything you thought you knew about faith, family, and the safety of small-town life. This isn't just another unsolved mystery lost to time. This is the true story of the Higgins family, a tale soaked in chilling detail, eerie silence, and the forbidden rituals of a secret society that thrived beneath the very heart of a quiet Yorkshire village. In the autumn of 1965, Thomas Higgins, his wife Eleanina, and their 2 children, Margaret Rose and William Thomas, seemed to vanish into thin air from their neat stone cottage in Ashworth, a place so small that even the faintest gossip usually circled the entire community within hours. But on this occasion, no whispers could explain where the Higgins family had gone, and no polite conversations over pints at the Shepherd's Rest could pierce the sudden, sinister silence that settled over Ashworth like the autumn fog. For weeks, villagers invented innocent theories, an unexpected job offer, a sudden illness, but none of them matched the growing unease that curled through the cobblestone streets, leaving even lifelong neighbors exchanging wary glances. It wasn't until 3 months later, when investigators forced open a section of the stone floor beneath St. Mary's Church, that this small village's picture-perfect facade shattered. Hidden in darkness, they found a secret chamber filled with the family's belongings and journals, describing terrifying secrets and occult ceremonies that the Church of England had banned centuries earlier. Even more disturbing, the last journal entry was written 2 weeks after the Higgins family was declared missing, suggesting they may have been alive, and possibly trapped, in an underworld few dared imagine. For nearly 60 years the church refused to speak publicly about what was uncovered, leaving the Higgins cottage to sit abandoned, its windows dark and its door forever shut, as though the village itself was afraid of remembering. But that's not the most chilling part. When sealed church records were finally opened in 1985, investigators discovered the Higgins family were not the first to vanish under sinister circumstances, and the hidden chamber beneath St. Mary's Church had been used for rituals stretching back decades. This wasn't merely a family tragedy. It was a dark history nightmare implicating respected villagers, clergymen, and possibly generations of secret worship tied to rituals that demanded human sacrifice. Tonight, I'm going to show you shocking evidence never made public until now, including hidden testimonies and documents that reveal how a seemingly peaceful community became the perfect cover for one of England's most disturbing true crime cult mysteries. And as you listen, ask yourself, could something like this be happening right now in a village just like yours? Because in stories like this, the most terrifying monsters aren't strangers lurking in the dark. They're the neighbors you thought you knew. Stay with me, because what I'm about to tell you may change how you look at every quiet street, every ancient church tower, and every smiling face in a small town. The scariest part of any true crime mystery isn't the monster you expect. It's the realization that the monster might be the man who sat beside you in church every Sunday. Ashworth, the small Yorkshire village that should have been a tranquil refuge from the modern world, hid secrets older and darker than the stone walls of St. Mary's Church itself. Secrets so carefully guarded that even whispers could mean exile from a community where everyone's family name went back generations. This wasn't merely another cold case to be filed away under the label of unsolved mysteries. This was a slow-burning horror that simmered beneath the surface of everyday life. A story woven into the village's DNA like ivy crawling over ancient stone. For nearly 3 months after the Higgins family disappeared, an uneasy quietness blanketed Ashworth, punctuated only by the toll of church bells that seemed somehow deeper, as if their echoes were resonating from beneath the ground instead of above. Mrs. Agnes Peaton, who'd lived next to St. Mary's for 63 years, began noticing the bells ringing at strange hours, soft and mournful peals that seemed to vibrate through the earth itself. Others claimed the fog rolling off the Yorkshire dales at dusk grew so thick it felt alive, as though it was hiding more than just the crumbling gravestones in the churchyard. But none of those eerie changes could compare to what was found under the church, a chamber where the very air seemed to tremble with the weight of forbidden history. The villagers, bound by centuries of shared bloodlines and silent agreements, began avoiding conversations about the Higgins family altogether, their polite smiles stretching thin, eyes darting away at the mention of Thomas, Elena, Margaret, or little Billy. Even those who had loved the family couldn't escape the feeling that something ancient and terrifying had been awakened, like an echo of pagan rites whispered across centuries. And when the sealed church records were unlatched in 1985, what they revealed exploded like dynamite beneath the village's carefully constructed facade. The hidden chamber beneath St. Mary's had been used not just for storage, but for ritual sacrifice. And the Higgins family were only the latest in a string of disappearances, stretching back decades. This wasn't an accident, This was a design. Documents showed that respected villagers had been involved in ceremonies aiming to preserve some ancient covenant, believing that only through blood could Ashworth remain protected from unseen forces. And if you think cults and secret societies are just modern inventions or Netflix fiction, think again. Because what happened in Ashworth proves that even the most picturesque village, where generations have worshipped under the same church spire, can become a hunting ground for those chasing dark truths and forbidden rituals. What kept the villagers silent wasn't just fear. It was the possibility that what they were doing was necessary to keep something far worse from breaking through. And that single thought, that monstrous acts might somehow be righteous, is the most chilling part of this entire true crime nightmare. Stay with me, because in the next part, we'll step back into the fog-draped streets of 1965 Yorkshire to meet the Higgins family as they were, before whispers of cults and secret rituals swallowed them whole, and before the village's haunting past collided with its blood-soaked secrets. Sometimes the most terrifying evil doesn't come crashing through your door. It's already inside your house, wearing the faces of the people you love. As the days grew shorter, and autumn bled into the raw chill of winter in 1965, Ashworth seemed to slip further into a kind of collective trance, the village frozen between suspicion and denial, its ivy-clad cottages hiding more than hearthfires and family secrets. To any outsider, Ashworth was simply another dot on the map, nestled among the rolling curves of the Yorkshire dales, its narrow lanes winding between dry stone walls older than memory itself. But for those who lived there, the Higgins family's disappearance had cracked something deeper open, a hidden fracture in the village's soul that no one wanted to look at too closely. The official story was simple. Thomas Higgins, diligent postmaster and devout churchwarden, had suddenly taken his wife and 2 children and vanished, leaving behind a perfectly tidy cottage and no clues. Yet behind every polite nod and every cup of tea poured into trembling hands, the whispers grew more frantic. "People don't just vanish," hissed Mrs. Peaton to Mr. Finch behind the counter of the general store. "Not without reason." And as the fog thickened over the rooftops and the tolling church bells deepened into that strange, mournful resonance, a chilling realization began to seep through Ashworth's old stones. Maybe the reason was lurking beneath St. Mary's Church itself. When investigators pried open the hidden chamber under the limestone floors, they found not merely dust and forgotten relics, but a room that breathed darkness, its stone walls etched with symbols that blurred the line between Christian iconography and something far older, far more sinister. There were the Higgins family's possessions, Elena's wedding ring gleaming cold atop a black altar stained with substances no one wanted to test. Thomas's pocket watch stopped at a time no one could agree upon. Margaret's blue school ribbon laid out like an offering, and Billy's small toy soldier standing guard over secrets too monstrous for an 8-year-old to ever imagine. And yet, the true horror wasn't only in what the chamber held, it was in what the villagers chose not to say. "The old covenant must be honored at all costs," read the note scrawled in Eleanor's delicate script inside the margins of a Bible found on the Higgins desk. Beneath it, Thomas's writing trembled. "God help us all. I fear we've gone too far to turn back." It was this duality, the blending of mundane village life with dark rituals whispered through the centuries, that transformed the Higgins case from a mere unsolved mystery into one of the most disturbing chapters in England's dark history. Because if a family as ordinary, as respected, as intertwined with the life of Ashworth as the Higginses could be swept into the shadows, then the boundaries between good and evil weren't nearly as solid as the villagers believed. This wasn't just a disappearance, it was an erasure. And the real terror lies in the knowledge that perhaps the people of Ashworth didn't want the Higgins family found at all. Stay with me, because next we'll peel back the polite smiles and hymns of St. Mary's congregation to reveal a community willing to sacrifice anything and anyone to protect its chilling secrets. What if everything you believed about safety, community, and faith was just a beautiful facade hiding an ancient conspiracy willing to swallow you whole? Ashworth wasn't supposed to be a place where nightmares took root. It was the kind of village where children raced along narrow lanes bordered by centuries-old stone walls, where neighbors traded gossip over market stalls, and the air smelled of heather and wood smoke. But the year 1965 cast a long shadow across that picturesque calm. Because in Ashworth, the Higgins family wasn't just another family. They were woven into the fabric of village life. Thomas Higgins was as steady as the stone church tower that dominated the skyline. The village postmaster who knew every name, every secret letter delivered to cottages tucked into the hills. He'd inherited his job, his house, and even his cautious temperament from a father and grandfather who'd served Ashworth before him. Elena, his wife, was a paradox. Practical and elegant, devoted mother, and quietly fascinated scholar of the village's forbidden history. She tended her garden not only for beauty, but for herbs and flowers once used in rituals the church had long condemned. To most, she was simply a woman keeping old customs alive, but to a few, her curiosity seemed a dangerous crack in the village's perfect facade. Their children were the hope of Ashworth's future. Margaret, just 12, carried an intensity that sometimes made people uneasy, as if her dark eyes were windows into truths she wasn't old enough to bear. Billy, 8, charmed everyone, even as his innocent sketches grew darker, crowded with robed figures and flickering candles. They were the kind of family you thought you knew, until you realized you didn't know them at all. And that's where Ashworth's real terror lies. Because in a village so small, so close-knit, there should have been no secrets, and yet the Higgins family slipped away unnoticed, leaving behind a void no rumor could fill. Was it sudden madness? Was it murder? Or something far more ancient, pulsing beneath the limestone foundations of St. Mary's Church? This wasn't just a disappearance. It was the first visible crack in a reality Ashworth desperately wanted to believe was unbreakable. And the more you learn about the Higgins family, the more you'll ask yourself, if evil could hide so perfectly there, how can we ever be sure it's not hiding here right now? Because every village has its secrets, and some are buried so deep they're almost impossible to see until they drag you under. Stay with me, because the story of the Higgins family isn't just a chilling mystery. It's a question mark hanging over every quiet street in every town that thinks it's safe. In places like Ashworth, secrets don't stay buried because no one's digging. They stay buried because everyone agrees to look away. If you'd asked anyone in the autumn of 1965, they'd have sworn on generations of family graves that Ashworth was untouched by the modern world's darkness. But beneath the polite nods and market-day chatter, the villagers knew there were places even sunlight seemed afraid to touch. St. Mary's Church wasn't just the spiritual heart of Ashworth, it was its spinal cord, a towering mass of Norman stone looming over narrow lanes like a silent judge. And it was here that the village's history bled into legend. They said the church was built on a far older Saxon site, and before that, perhaps on grounds sacred to people whose names no longer exist. That wasn't just folklore. It was a warning. Because for those who bothered to look closely, the signs were always there. The heavy oak doors groaned like a living thing in the Yorkshire wind. The carved stone gargoyles seemed to watch the villagers come and go with sly, knowing smiles. And every autumn, when the fog rolled in from the moors, the shadows grew longer around St. Mary's, as if the stones themselves were whispering secrets too old to speak aloud. Ashworth wasn't just a village, it was a perfect hiding place for forbidden truths. Into this world stepped the Higgins family, fitting so seamlessly into village life that no one saw how deep they were sinking into something ancient. Thomas, ever punctual, ever polite, moving through his routines like clockwork. Elena, her eyes bright with curiosity, that some mistook for harmless eccentricity. Margaret, with her notebooks filled with gravestone inscriptions and strange myths. Billy, clutching his pencil like a wand, summoning images that made grown men shiver. If there's one lesson from the story of Ashworth, it's this. The more perfect the mask, the darker the face beneath. As October 1965 advanced, things shifted subtly, but unmistakably. Elena began spending hours among the graves after dark, carrying bundles of herbs and flowers that older villagers recognized from recipes no one spoke of anymore. Thomas grew pale and distracted, as though every letter he sorted at the post office carried hidden meanings only he could see. Margaret's essays turned from history and poetry to cryptic references about truths older than the church and covenants that cannot be broken. And Billy's drawings filled with robed figures circled around altars lit by flickering candles. Yet despite the growing unease, most villagers chose silence over confrontation, because confronting the strange meant tearing open the fragile peace that Ashworth depended on. Denial isn't ignorance, it's self-preservation. But the day would come when denial could no longer hold back what lay beneath the church's ancient stones. And in the quiet of the Higgins cottage, behind drawn curtains and polite smiles, something was happening that would rip apart Ashworth's reality and leave behind a legend whispered as one of England's most haunting unsolved mysteries. Stay with me, because we're only beginning to glimpse the depths of the secret that devoured the Higgins family and threatened to consume the soul of an entire village. The greatest trick darkness ever pulled was convincing an entire village that it didn't exist. In Ashworth, nothing was ever random. The village worked like a finely crafted timepiece, each family a gear turning in quiet synchrony, each tradition a cog linking past to present. But as the autumn of 1965 deepened, it was as though someone had dropped a grain of sand into the mechanism, and the gears began to grind with an almost imperceptible tension. Mrs. Peaton, who spent decades watching the comings and goings from her lace-curtained window, noted that Elena Higgins started visiting St. Mary's after dark more and more frequently, carrying satchels filled with herbs and coarse salt. Proper observances, Elena called them when pressed, though her eyes carried a glint that made even the boldest villagers step back. At the general store, Mr. Arthur Finch watched with quiet alarm as she bought items in strange quantities. Dozens of white candles, herbs known only to the oldest villagers, and stacks of coarse salt enough to ward off an army of demons. When questioned, Elena would simply smile and say, "I'm preparing for the harvest season." But in Ashworth, even small changes carried the weight of centuries, and people began to whisper that the harvest she spoke of had little to do with crops. In villages like Ashworth, nothing grows without roots, and some roots sink into places far older and darker than anyone wants to admit. Meanwhile, Thomas Higgins, the man whose life had once moved with mechanical precision, seemed a man undone. Once punctual to the minute, he began arriving late to the post office, shadows under his eyes, fingers trembling as he sorted letters as though each envelope carried secrets too heavy to hold. The villagers noticed, though few dared speak of it, because to ask questions would mean acknowledging that something was unraveling in the very heart of Ashworth. And that, perhaps, the Higgins family was only the beginning. Margaret Rose Higgins, usually quiet and studious, began filling her notebooks with cryptic inscriptions copied from the oldest gravestones, or references to the Old Covenant, and truths the church dared not keep. Teachers who praised her intelligence grew uneasy, as her essays turned dense with references to rites and seasons, to cycles that predated even Christianity's arrival in the Yorkshire Dales. Billy, ever the village's golden child, became consumed by drawings, pages and pages of robed figures standing around black stone altars, eyes wide as though caught in some eternal vigil. And when Miss Sarah Collins asked him gently what they were, Billy only replied, "It's what Mommy and Reverend Whitmore said we must remember." That single sentence rippled through Ashworth like a tremor beneath ancient stone. Because the true terror of Ashworth wasn't simply that people disappeared. It was that maybe, just maybe, everyone else knew why. Yet the village continued to hum along. Market days arrived as scheduled. Church bells tolled at their appointed hours, and the residents buried unease beneath layers of ritual and routine. But a sense of impending revelation hung over every conversation, every polite nod in the churchyard. Denial is the last defense of a reality about to shatter. Because if the Higgins family could be touched by darkness so absolute, then no one in Ashworth could ever be certain that the monsters weren't already inside the walls. Stay with me, because we're about to step into the deepest shadows of St. Mary's Church, where stone and silence hold truths that could unravel an entire village, and perhaps every certainty you've ever believed about your own. This isn't just a story, it's a warning. The scariest prisons don't have walls. They're built from silence, secrets, and the knowledge that if you speak, you might be next. As October 1965 crawled towards its final days, Ashworth was no longer merely a village tucked in the folds of the Yorkshire Dales. It was a crucible where fear simmered, where every polite conversation carried an undercurrent of dread no one dared name. Thomas Higgins, once the quiet pillar of the community, was unraveling before the village's eyes, his rigid routines collapsing under the weight of secrets he could neither contain nor confess. He moved through Ashworth like a man caught between worlds, greeting neighbors with eyes that darted to shadows as though expecting someone, or something, to step from the mist. In his small office behind the post counter, letters lay unsorted as his trembling fingers traced invisible patterns on the wooden desk. "It's like he was waiting for the floor beneath him to open up and swallow him whole," Mrs. Peaton whispered to her friend as they passed the post office, careful to keep their voices low. But Elelanina was the true storm-gathering force. No longer simply the elegant woman tending her herb garden, she became a figure moving at odd hours through the graveyard, her silhouette framed by flickering lantern light. Rumors flew that she was carrying out proper observances, rituals tied to cycles older than Christianity itself, rituals that might be the only thing holding back something far worse. Yet every explanation felt like a lie too polite to speak the truth. That Ashworth was under siege from forces that had been waiting centuries to be set free. And still the village remained silent. Because to speak out meant becoming marked. And no one in Ashworth wanted to be the next name whispered over the church pews. Thomas tried to break free of the tightening grip around his family. He sought out Reverend Whitmore, intending to demand answers, to save his wife and children from whatever was consuming them. But in the rectory office, surrounded by shelves lined with crumbling tomes and occult symbols half buried beneath theological texts, Whitmore offered no comfort. Instead, he spoke softly of obligations older than any man, of covenants that cannot be broken. His words dripped with the kind of calm certainty that makes monsters seem almost reasonable. Some truths, Thomas, are too sacred to be denied, and some debts can only be paid in blood. Thomas stumbled from that room as though he'd gazed into a chasm he could never climb out of. At home, the walls of the Higgins cottage seemed to close in around him. The children grew secretive, whispering in corners, glancing nervously toward the church tower that loomed over every rooftop in Ashworth. Margaret's essays shifted entirely into cryptic passages about ancient gods and the thin places where worlds meet. Billy's once cheerful drawings darkened into twisted visions of hooded figures chanting around a black altar. The laughter in their home fell silent, replaced by a tension that coiled tighter each hour. Ashworth was becoming a village where fear didn't just live in the shadows. It was the air they breathed. And outside, the villagers watched the Higgins family vanish piece by piece, day after day, as though they were dissolving into mist. But no one stepped forward, because in Ashworth, the price of knowing the truth was higher than most were willing to pay. It wasn't just the Higgins family being hunted. It was anyone who dared look too closely at the darkness swallowing them all. Stay with me, because we're about to cross a line that even Ashworth's secrets couldn't keep hidden forever. A line drenched in blood and echoing with chants older than the church itself. This is where the nightmare begins. Sometimes the real horror isn't what's hiding in the shadows. It's realizing that the people you trust are the ones drawing the curtains to keep you in the dark. In the final weeks of October 1965, the air in Ashworth felt charged, as though an electrical storm was building unseen, pressing down on the village's narrow lanes and creeping into the bones of every stone cottage. The villagers carried on with polite smiles, market day greetings, and Sunday prayers, but their eyes flicked toward the Higgins cottage with barely concealed dread. Because behind those walls, something was shifting from secret to sinister. Thomas Higgins no longer slept through the night. He paced the floor until dawn, a man gnawed hollow by fear. He'd stopped confiding in friends, terrified that even asking questions might draw attention from those who watched from the shadows. Dr. Edmund Carr, the village physician, recorded in his private notes that Thomas arrived at his office 3 times that October, each visit more desperate than the last. Thomas spoke of ancient obligations, of ceremonies that can't be stopped once they begin, and asked whether evil could linger in places where terrible things had once been done. Dr. Carr, himself entangled deeper than Thomas realized, gently steered him away from discussing specifics. And that was the worst betrayal of all. The people who should have helped were the ones ensuring the truth remained hidden. In Ashworth, even the doctors were gatekeepers of secrets. Meanwhile, Elena's transformation grew impossible to ignore. She would vanish for hours into the mists around St. Mary's, returning with eyes shining with fervor, and hands dusted with ash and crushed herbs. Her neighbors whispered that she was no longer entirely present, as though her mind was trapped between two worlds. At home, she began preparing spiritual cleansings, burning herbs that released acrid smoke, leaving the walls streaked with soot and filling the air with a scent that clung to clothes and hair like a curse. Margaret and Billy, once fixtures of village laughter, became phantoms drifting silently beside their mother, their faces pale, eyes fixed on something no one else could see. Teachers noticed Margaret's handwriting changing, the loops growing sharp and angular as her essays shifted to cryptic warnings about portals that must remain closed, and the blood price of forgetting. Billy stopped speaking altogether except to murmur phrases that sounded like half-remembered prayers in a language no one recognized. And through it all, Reverend Whitmore continued to preach from the pulpit of St. Mary's about covenants older than any kingdom, his voice echoing off limestone walls while parishioners stared at him with hollow eyes, torn between devotion and unspeakable fear. In Ashworth, faith and terror had become indistinguishable. And the villagers, the same people who'd once offered each other tea and warm fires, began avoiding eye contact, their footsteps quickening past the Higgins cottage, as though proximity alone might stain them with the same dark fate. Because when the truth becomes too monstrous to face, silence is survival. Ashworth had become a village where secrets were currency, where even a careless word might sign your death warrant. And as the fog thickened around the spire of St. Mary's, the question hanging over Ashworth was no longer simply, where is the Higgins family? But, how many of us are willing to sacrifice them to save ourselves? Stay with me. Because what comes next isn't just a story. It's a descent into the darkest corridors of true crime cult mysteries, where salvation and damnation sometimes wear the same face. This is the moment where the line between neighbor and executioner disappears. The most dangerous kind of evil isn't the one that creeps in from outside. It's the one we welcome in because it wears the mask of tradition. By the final days of October 1965, Ashworth felt like a village under siege, not by soldiers or visible enemies, but by a darkness that seemed to pulse from beneath its very streets. The air grew so heavy it was as though even the fog had weight, pressing itself against doors and windows, seeping into the cracks of old stone cottages. Neighbors who once traded gossip at the post office now barely spoke at all, eyes sliding away if anyone so much as whispered the name, Higgins. Inside the Higgins cottage, Thomas tried to hold his family together, as if by sheer will. But Elena was slipping further beyond his reach. She spent hours kneeling on the floorboards, chanting in whispers, arranging herbs and symbols into patterns that only she understood. The smell of burning sage and bitter resins clung to the walls, mingling with the sharp metallic tang of fear. Margaret, usually so precise in her studies, scribbled frantic notes in the margins of her schoolbooks, references to sacred geometry and veils between worlds. Billy, once a boy of endless questions and bright laughter, now spoke in riddles, his voice strangely flat, his eyes tracing unseen patterns in the plaster ceiling. "He's drawing the maps," Elena said one night, almost dreamily, when Thomas demanded to know what Billy's sketches meant. "So we don't get lost when the doors open." Outside, villagers pretended nothing was happening. Mrs. Peaton, peering through her lace curtains, saw Elena leave the house late at night, clutching bundles of herbs and candles, slipping into the churchyard as though drawn by invisible strings. Mr. Finch, at the general store, began refusing to stock certain items, white candles, coarse salt, strange herbs, hoping to slow whatever it was that Elena was preparing. But everyone knew it was already too late. Because the rituals had moved beyond harmless folklore into something far darker. Reverend Whitmore's sermons grew more cryptic, layered with references to the Old Covenant and the blood that secures the walls between worlds. Parishioners sat in silence, faces pale, hands twisting in laps as he spoke of times appointed since the dawn of man. It wasn't religion anymore. It was indoctrination. And the villagers were caught between the horror of what they suspected and the terror of confirming it. In Ashworth, the greatest sin wasn't believing in monsters. It was daring to admit they existed. Thomas, desperate, returned to Dr. Carr one final time. His words tumbled out in a feverish rush about hidden rooms, dark ceremonies, and the conviction that his family had been chosen for something unspeakable. Dr. Carr, eyes shadowed, told Thomas gently to go home and rest. But the doctor's trembling hands and flickering gaze betrayed that he knew far more than he would ever say. Because in Ashworth, knowledge wasn't power. It was a death sentence. As Halloween approached, an almost electric tension gripped the village. Lanterns flickered like watchful eyes. The fog grew so thick that St. Mary's spire vanished entirely some nights, as if the church itself had been swallowed by the past. And in the Higgins house, Thomas lay awake, listening to Elena's low chanting and the children's soft, secret conversations, knowing with a terrible certainty that the thing stalking his family wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from within. And that's the nightmare of Ashworth, realizing that sometimes the enemy has your own blood in its veins. Stay with me, because we're about to step into a darkness from which the village would never truly emerge. A darkness that demanded not just secrets, but sacrifices. In places like Ashworth, the silence doesn't mean safety. It means the ritual has already begun. As October 31st, 1965 crept closer, Ashworth teetered on the edge of revelation and ruin. The village moved through its routines as if hypnotized, while every shadow seemed alive, every gust of wind carrying whispers only certain ears could hear. It was the kind of hush that comes before a scream. On that final Sunday morning, the Higgins family attended service at St. Mary's one last time, sitting in their usual pew in the third row. But nothing about that morning felt normal. Parishioners later spoke of the way Elena sat perfectly still, eyes locked on Reverend Whitmore, scribbling notes into a small leather journal. Thomas's face was drained of color, his hands knotted together, knuckles white. Margaret and Billy sat side by side in eerie silence, eyes unfocused, as if listening to something no one else could hear. And from the pulpit, Reverend Whitmore preached about ancient covenants that must not be broken, his words weaving between scripture and secrets, his voice trembling with restrained fervor. It wasn't a sermon. It was a warning delivered in code. After the service, the Higgins family left quickly, avoiding greetings, moving as though propelled by some invisible force. They were last seen entering their cottage around 2:30 p.m., the door closing behind them with a finality that seemed to echo through the village. And then the cottage went dark. Mrs. Peaton, who had watched the family for years, noticed the lights extinguished by 8 o'clock, a detail that might have seemed ordinary if not for what followed. In the hours past midnight, she was awoken by a sound that seemed half music, half moaning wind. Peering through her curtains, she saw the churchyard lit by a procession of flickering candles. Figures in dark robes moved in a perfect circle around St. Mary's, their voices chanting words that made no sense, yet chilled her to the marrow. Some voices were high and clear. Children's voices. And Mrs. Peaton, clutching the curtains, felt a truth claw its way into her chest. The Higgins children were among them. It wasn't just the family being taken. It was the entire village handing them over. In the days that followed, the Higgins cottage stood silent, the curtains drawn tight, as though even the house itself wished to forget. Mr. Walsh, Thomas's supervisor, found the home immaculate. The Sunday dinner dishes washed and put away, clothes laid out for Monday morning. But there was no sign of life. And on Thomas's desk sat an open Bible, turned to the Book of Revelation. In the margin, Elena had written, "The Old Covenant must be honored at all costs." And beneath it, in Thomas's unsteady hand, were the words, "God help us all. I fear we have gone too far to turn back." The village clung to its silence. Even when Sergeant Henley began his investigation, doors stayed closed, voices dropped to whispers. Because everyone knew that the truth wasn't merely dangerous, it was contagious. In Ashworth, secrets didn't just kill families. They killed the very idea of trust. And all the while, the villagers pretended life went on, because to admit the horror would be to admit that evil had been living among them for generations, wearing their faces, speaking with their voices. Stay with me, because we're about to pull back the last veil, and what waits on the other side may change how you look at every neighbor, every priest, every quiet village lane. This isn't just history. It's the anatomy of how communities become accomplices to darkness. What if the people meant to protect you were the very architects of your doom? For nearly 3 months after the Higgins family vanished, Ashworth existed in a limbo of whispers and half-truths, pretending normalcy while the smell of fear hung thick as the moor fog. It might have remained that way forever, if not for what Sergeant Henley found beneath St. Mary's Church. Because the real story wasn't just that the Higgins family disappeared. It was what the village had built its entire identity to hide. When Henley returned to the church for a second search, driven by Miss Collins' evidence and the children's chilling drawings, he measured walls and corridors, and realized the architecture didn't add up. Certain stone sections were thicker than they should have been. Passages ended abruptly against solid walls that felt strangely hollow. And behind the altar, a loose stone shifted under Henley's touch. What he discovered was a tunnel descending into the earth. A passage carved into bedrock, winding downward as though digging into the very marrow of the village's soul. And at the bottom, he found the hidden chamber, a place that should not exist. The walls were carved with symbols that bled together Christianity and something older, more primal. The floor was arranged in a pattern that seemed to pull your eyes toward the center, where a massive black stone altar stood stained with dark residues. Around it were scattered personal items. Elelanina's wedding ring gleamed coldly. Thomas's pocket watch lay stopped at an hour no one could agree upon. Margaret's school ribbon lay folded like an offering. And Billy's toy soldier stood sentinel over secrets too monstrous for any child to bear. But it was the journals that ripped the mask off Ashworth's face. Bound in cracked leather, ink faded with age, they contained the true history of the Historical Preservation Society. Pages revealed that what began as research into folklore had spiraled into the restoration of rituals older than Christianity, rituals that demanded blood to protect the village. And the names inside those journals were a who's who of Ashworth's most respected citizens: Reverend Whitmore, Dr. Carr, Mrs. Thornton. Entries spoke clinically of choosing families for sacrifice, detailing how the victims were convinced to join willingly, believing they were part of a sacred ceremony. It wasn't murder. It was devotion twisted into slaughter. Father Blackwood's older writings showed the same pattern stretching back decades, recording how entire families were elevated through rituals designed to keep Ashworth safe from undefined forces. And then, Henley found Eleanor's journal, and the final blow fell. Her entries shifted from curiosity to obsession, describing visions and voices urging her to complete a harvest ritual. She believed her family was chosen to fulfill a covenant centuries in the making. Her last words were ecstatic. "Tonight we shall open the door, and the blood of the faithful will seal our protection." Beneath it, in Thomas's shaking hand, one final line: "God help us all. We have gone too far to turn back." And that's the nightmare Ashworth left behind. Not just that people can vanish, but that they can vanish willingly into the arms of monsters they believe are saving them. Stay with me, because what Henley uncovered didn't just explain the Higgins family. It exposed a blueprint for how entire communities can become complicit in evil, and never even realize they've crossed the line. This wasn't just murder. It was faith weaponized into a conspiracy so vast it bled into the stones of an English village. The most terrifying monsters are the ones that convince you they're saving your soul. When Sergeant Henley began reading the journals recovered from beneath St. Mary's, it wasn't simply evidence of murder. It was the unmaking of everything he believed about human nature, faith, and community. Because what lay in those pages wasn't just a record of crimes. It was a doctrine, a dark theology that had infiltrated every corner of Ashworth. Father Blackwood's earliest entries in the 1920s read almost scholarly at first. Musings on folklore, medieval rites, and ancient symbols carved into Yorkshire stones. But soon the tone shifted, as though some presence was whispering to him from the chamber's cold walls. He wrote about voices in the dark, visions of blood and sacrifice, and a promise that the village would thrive if it honored the old covenant. His logic was chillingly precise. Select families, perform rites, and in return, Ashworth would be protected from plague, famine, or disaster. The first victims were the Morrison family in 1930, followed by the Hartwells in 1933. Each time, Blackwood's entries read like surgical reports rather than confessions of murder. He noted weather conditions, ritual timings, precise steps required to complete the offering. It was evil wearing the mask of meticulous record-keeping. Whitmore's later entries were even more horrifying. He inherited Blackwood's beliefs, but refined them into a psychological machine designed to transform normal families into willing sacrifices. He documented how to isolate individuals, how to create dependency, how to fracture families with secrecy until they'd walk willingly into the chamber beneath St. Mary's. He wrote of testing the spiritual pliability of candidates, of planting ideas through sermons, casual conversations, and harmless folklore discussions. It wasn't murder. It was grooming on a scale no one suspected. Henley discovered that each murder was more than a killing. It was a show of power designed to keep the community silent. In exchange for prosperity and quiet lives, Ashworth offered up blood. And the most soul-crushing truth was this: many villagers knew. Not every detail, not every dark ritual, but enough to suspect that families didn't simply move away. Enough to notice the pattern, to see cottages swiftly rented to newcomers after each vanishing. Mrs. Thornton's notes described how rumors were controlled, how new tenants were told the former families had emigrated, how valuable possessions were redistributed among trusted members of the Historical Preservation Society. It wasn't just murder. It was social engineering. And perhaps the most devastating blow came from Eleanor's final journal. Her last entries glowed with fervor. She believed the rituals weren't merely survival, they were sacred, that the blood spilled wasn't death, but a cosmic payment preserving Ashworth's existence. She wrote about feeling chosen, about how the thin places between worlds had opened and the old covenant demanded a family's blood to close them again. She wrote of seeing visions of Thomas hesitating, of Whitmore reassuring her that Thomas would be persuaded before the night was through. And then the final line in trembling ink. We go willingly, for only then is the sacrifice pure. And that's how Ashworth became a monument to one truth. Sometimes, the line between faith and madness is drawn in blood. Stay with me, because the final revelations will show that Ashworth wasn't an anomaly. It was a blueprint. And if it could happen there, it could happen anywhere. The greatest horror is discovering that the monsters were never hiding. They were standing beside you, shaking your hand, calling you friend. As Henley pieced together the final strands of evidence, a truth emerged that shattered not just the illusion of Ashworth's tranquility, but any faith in how well we ever truly know the people around us. Because the conspiracy wasn't the work of a few deranged minds. It was a collective act of silent complicity. From Father Blackwood's first rituals in the 1920s to Reverend Whitmore's elaborate psychological manipulation, the pattern was chillingly consistent. The village offered families as sacrifices in the belief that such blood payments would safeguard them from the unpredictable chaos of life, disease, famine, economic ruin. They believed that Ashworth's serene existence was a gift earned through the old covenant, and so, they traded neighbors for security. They believed that blood spilled in secret was the price of peace. The journals revealed how the Historical Preservation Society's research was merely the gateway drug. It lured in those with intellectual curiosity, a thirst for meaning, or a desire to feel special. Lectures about folklore gave way to private ceremonies in the hidden chamber beneath St. Mary's. Whitmore recorded how the rituals had evolved, blending legitimate historical detail with invented rites designed to test loyalty. Participants were isolated, their doubts corroded by group pressure, by whispered references to sacred truths, too dangerous for outsiders. It wasn't a cult in the desert. It was a cult hiding in the cozy glow of village life. And Henley learned something even darker. The murders were never random. The families chosen were often newcomers, or those without deep family roots, making it easier to erase them. But sometimes, as in the Higgins case, the chosen were locals. A calculated decision to maintain belief in the ritual's power. Eleanor's transformation from curious researcher to fervent believer was a masterclass in psychological grooming. Her journals showed how Whitmore fed her obscure texts, invited her into secret rituals, convinced her that Ashworth's survival depended on her family's sacrifice. Eleanor's final entries spoke of visions, voices promising the gates between worlds would close if the blood offering was pure. She wrote of the chamber beneath the church as a place where the stones remember, and claimed she'd been chosen by forces older than time. Thomas's final scribbled notes discovered in the chamber were even more gut-wrenching. He begged forgiveness for failing to save his family. He confessed that Whitmore and the others had warned him that resistance would doom not just the Higginses, but the entire village. His last words were chilling. We became our own executioners. And that was the final fracture in Henley's sanity. Because the true monster wasn't Whitmore, or Blackwood, or even Eleanor. It was the village itself. The villagers knew. Even those who never set foot in the chamber sensed the pattern. Yet they chose silence over truth. Because in Ashworth, the terror of confronting the evil next door was greater than the guilt of ignoring it. In the end, Ashworth wasn't just a crime scene. It was a monument to how communities can murder their own conscience. Stay with me, because the final piece of this story will show why the terror of Ashworth didn't die in that chamber, and how the seeds of such horror might lie hidden in any quiet village, anywhere in the world. This is the anatomy of complicity, and it's the scariest story you'll ever hear. Sometimes the echoes of horror don't fade. They become the pulse of the place where it happened. In the aftermath of the Higgins investigation, Ashworth ceased to exist as the village it had once been. What was left wasn't just a collection of crumbling cottages and overgrown lanes. It was a wound that never healed, a living monument to how easily ordinary people can become the architects of unspeakable evil. Because once the truth came out, no one in Ashworth could ever pretend innocence again. As Henley's investigation exploded into public view, journalists flooded the village, drawn by headlines screaming of dark rituals, ritual sacrifice, cult secrets, hidden chambers, and entire families erased. Ashworth became the epicenter of the kind of true crime horror that grips the world's imagination. Yet for the people who had lived there, it wasn't a headline. It was the shattering of every foundation they'd trusted. The quiet village they'd built their lives around was now the stage for a global nightmare. The trials were sensational, dragging into the open the names of the village's most respected figures. Reverend Whitmore was declared mentally unfit, but found guilty, confined indefinitely to an institution where he spent his days muttering about portals and blood debts. Dr. Carr, Mrs. Thornton, and several others received life sentences, while smaller players received lesser punishments for obstruction and conspiracy. But the damage couldn't be confined to courtrooms. Property values collapsed overnight. Shops closed. The school shut down for lack of pupils. Even the church, once the spiritual heart of Ashworth, was deconsecrated and demolished, the land covered over and grassed as if hoping to bury the memories beneath green silence. But some memories refused to stay buried. Because even as the physical scars faded, the psychological wounds festered. Children who grew up hearing whispers of the Higgins family suffered from night terrors, unable to reconcile the idea that the kindly doctor, the gentle librarian, the vicar with the patient voice, had been participants in ritual murder. Adults who'd kept silent wrestled with guilt, asking themselves whether a single word from them might have saved an entire family. The real horror wasn't just what was done, but who did it. And Henley himself was never the same. Reports say he left the force within a year, plagued by nightmares, convinced that the same pattern of secrecy and sacrifice could be lurking in other villages, other quiet corners of England. He left behind a note that read simply, "Evil wears the faces of neighbors." Ashworth became a cautionary tale told in hushed tones among true crime communities, a blueprint for how dark conspiracies can bloom in the soil of small-town traditions. And the site of the Higgins cottage remained empty for years until it too was demolished, as if the village believed erasing the buildings could erase the memories. But even now, true crime enthusiasts, urban explorers, and seekers of forbidden truths make pilgrimages to the grassy mound where St. Mary's once stood, hoping to glimpse evidence of what really happened. Because if Ashworth taught the world anything, it's that the scariest monsters don't come from the outside. They're born right among us, in silence, in secrecy, in the name of keeping the peace. And that, more than the rituals or the murders, is why Ashworth's horror never truly ended. It's not just a village lost to time. It's a warning whispered through every quiet lane in every village that still believes evil can't live next door. The scariest part about evil is how quietly it folds itself into the fabric of everyday life. In the months following the explosive revelations in Ashworth, the village became a ghost of itself, hollowed out by secrets finally dragged into daylight. The world devoured every detail of the case, eager for updates on the fate of the villagers who'd harbored true crime's darkest conspiracy. But for those who had lived in Ashworth, no headline could capture the weight pressing down on their chests every time they remembered that they'd once smiled at the people who'd orchestrated murders in the name of salvation. Because it's one thing to fear monsters. It's another to realize you've shared tea with them. Survivors described how even mundane sounds, a church bell, a child's laugh, the wind rattling old windows, became triggers. Nightmares of chanting voices, robed figures, and hidden chambers haunted people who'd never even set foot in St. Mary's basement. Some villagers fled entirely, leaving behind properties they could no longer sell, unable to walk streets where every stone seemed soaked in secrets. Ashworth's lanes didn't just wind through the village, they twisted through people's memories like a knife. Local authorities tried to sanitize the village's image. Tour guides were forbidden from mentioning the Higgins family or the ritual sacrifices uncovered beneath St. Mary's. But whispers persisted, leaking into forums devoted to unsolved mysteries, dark conspiracies, and cult secrets. Urban explorers trespassed into the overgrown spaces where cottages once stood, hoping to glimpse evidence of rituals that had cost 63 lives over 35 years. Because even demolished walls remember the screams that once echoed inside them. The psychological toll was devastating. School children required therapy after learning that their headmaster, their doctor, their priest, had conspired in murders. They struggled to trust teachers, police, even their own parents. Older residents lived in isolation, crippled by guilt for suspecting the truth, yet saying nothing. The village became a textbook example of collective trauma, studied by criminologists, psychologists, and historians, seeking to understand how entire communities could become complicit in systematic murder. Ashworth wasn't just a village that lost its people. It lost its innocence, and perhaps its soul. Henley, the sergeant who uncovered the truth, disappeared from public view. Some say he emigrated. Others whisper he was institutionalized after nightmares drove him to the brink. His notes, found years later, were chillingly brief. Evil thrives where people are too polite to name it. And that was the real legacy of Ashworth. A lesson that beneath the gentle rhythms of rural life can hide a darkness so profound, it fractures reality. Ashworth didn't just show us that monsters can hide among us, it showed us how easy it is to become one if we think we're serving a greater good. True crime enthusiasts still pore over the records, convinced there are more secrets waiting to be uncovered. Because the ultimate horror isn't just what happened in Ashworth. It's the possibility that somewhere, in another quiet village, the same ritual is being prepared in silence. Because Ashworth's story is a map, and maps lead somewhere. Stay with me, because in the final moments of this journey, we'll explore why Ashworth's legacy is a warning that might be closer to home than any of us want to believe. History doesn't always bury its dead. Sometimes it keeps them close, whispering secrets that refuse to die. Even after the headlines faded and the reporters packed up their cameras, Ashworth was left to wrestle with the shadows cast by its own past. And in that silence, a deeper horror took root. The realization that the village's greatest betrayal wasn't just what had been done, but how many had chosen to look away. Because in Ashworth, silence was the currency that bought safety, and the price was blood. The villagers who remained tried to rebuild, but every familiar site was now haunted. The scent of wet stone brought memories of the chamber beneath St. Mary's. The toll of a distant church bell felt like a summons to rituals no one wanted to remember. Neighbors who once shared harvest festivals and wedding feasts now avoided each other's eyes, each wondering, "Did you know? Did you help?" Ashworth became the subject of documentaries, podcasts, and entire threads on forums dedicated to dark conspiracies, unsolved mysteries, and cult secrets. Scholars cited it as a chilling example of how forbidden knowledge and ritual sacrifice could metastasize into communal complicity. Yet no analysis could truly capture the emotional aftermath. The quiet, corrosive guilt that made people whisper even decades later. The real horror wasn't the chamber itself. It was how many people agreed to keep the door closed. Urban explorers still trespass onto the grass-covered mound where St. Mary's once stood, hoping to find evidence overlooked by the police. They post videos tagged, "True crime, forbidden history, dark secrets," fueling an endless loop of speculation and dread. Locals resent the attention, but can't deny the village's dark magnetism. Because the idea that such evil could flourish unseen makes Ashworth irresistible and terrifying. Children who grew up in Ashworth carry scars invisible yet profound. Many left as soon as they were old enough, determined never to return. Others stayed, but speak of dreams where stone walls bleed and familiar voices chant ancient words. They say the village got quiet again. But in Ashworth, quiet is never a good sign. Henley's name became synonymous with the case. Yet he vanished from public life, leaving behind a single cryptic statement. What happened in Ashworth didn't start there, and it didn't end there either. It's that notion that keeps Ashworth alive in the public's imagination. That somewhere, right now, another village might be rehearsing the same dark script, whispering the same forbidden prayers. Because Ashworth isn't just a place on a map. It's a lesson written in blood, reminding us that the true cost of ignorance is paid in human lives. And that's why, decades later, the story still reverberates. It's why the empty spaces where cottages once stood feel heavier than solid stone. Because Ashworth didn't merely lose families, it lost its identity, its innocence, and perhaps its very soul. And the question that should haunt all of us is this. If darkness came knocking on our doors, would we have the courage to speak? Or would we, like Ashworth, simply pull the curtains and pray it passes us by? That's the lingering terror of Ashworth. Not the rituals, not the murders, but the knowledge that monsters need only one thing to thrive: our silence. Sometimes the dead aren't the ones who haunt us. It's the living, carrying secrets they'll never confess. As years slipped into decades, Ashworth faded from headlines, but not from memory. The case became a dark icon in the world of true crime, discussed in documentaries, podcasts, and YouTube deep dives, dissecting every cryptic journal entry, every fragment of forbidden knowledge uncovered beneath St. Mary's. Yet even as the story spread globally, the deepest scars remained hidden in the quiet places left behind. Because Ashworth's ghosts don't walk. They whisper from the shadows of the mind. For those who survived, the trauma calcified into rituals of its own. Some villagers avoided mentioning the Higgins name, as though saying it aloud might summon back the darkness. Others spoke in hushed voices, carefully avoiding eye contact when recalling how Sunday sermons bled seamlessly into plans for ritual sacrifice. People confessed privately to therapists that every creak of the floorboards felt like footsteps approaching their door. That the wind in the trees sometimes sounded like chanting. That even the taste of the local spring water seemed different now, metallic, tainted by memories. Because once you know your neighbors were murderers, you can never taste innocence again. Scholars still study Ashworth as a textbook case in how dark conspiracies flourish not through brute force, but through gentle familiarity. They lecture about social complicity, cognitive dissonance, moral disengagement, fancy terms for how a village decided that silence was safer than truth. Yet no academic term can fully capture the intimate horror of realizing that the hands which baptized your child might also have held a knife over a stone altar. Ashworth's legacy isn't just a mystery solved. It's a wound that never closes. The property where St. Mary's once stood is now a grassy mound. No marker acknowledges what was found there. Yet every spring, locals report strange growths in the grass, patches where vegetation turns an unnatural color, blooming red or black. Urban legends claim it's the ground remembering blood spilled beneath its stones. Even the earth, it seems, refuses to forget. Former parishioners recall the sermons Reverend Whitmore delivered in his final years, sermons laced with references to ancient debts and barriers between worlds. Today, those same words have become viral keywords in videos tagged cult secrets, dark history, haunting legacy. Creators chasing views spin theories that Ashworth was merely one node in a vast network of secret societies, performing ritual sacrifices to manipulate fate itself. Whether those theories hold any truth is beside the point. The damage was already done. Because the real terror of Ashworth is not just what happened, it's how easily it could happen again. Because evil didn't come roaring into Ashworth like a beast. It crept in gently, wearing the face of the trusted, the educated, the spiritual. That's why even now, people feel drawn to the empty spaces where houses once stood, staring at doorsteps where the Higgins children once played, listening for echoes, hoping and fearing that they might hear whispers from beyond the veil. Because Ashworth didn't just lose families, it lost the belief that monsters live somewhere else. And that's why, decades later, its story still slithers through our nightmares. Because Ashworth is a reminder that the most horrifying secrets are the ones kept by the people we think we know best, and that sometimes, the past never really lets go. Because once a village has tasted blood in the name of salvation, there's no telling how long its hunger might sleep. So the next time someone tells you that true evil is rare, remember Ashworth, and remember how darkness hides behind familiar faces. If this story left you questioning how well you truly know your world, you're not alone. Because the real monsters don't always lurk in shadows. They sometimes smile from the next pew over. Tell me in the comments, could a place like Ashworth exist in your country? In your town? Hit like if you believe these truths deserve light. Save this video so you never forget how easily trust can be betrayed. And if you crave more chilling stories that peel back the masks of dark conspiracies and forbidden truths, subscribe right now. Because sometimes, the only protection we have is knowing.